Hi, my name's Anthony Turner. Today I'm interviewing Geoff Browne from the Small Business Commissioner's Office on behalf of the Small Business Institute. In a couple of previous interviews, Geoff, we spoke about what the Small Business Commissioner's Office does in a generic sense, and also the mediation processes. One of the areas that I remember from our first interview you mentioned is where the most issues come from is typically in the retail leasing environment. And I guess what I thought might be beneficial for the listeners and the viewers is to get a bit of an understanding of what are some of the traps and tips that are available for people who, and which is a large number of people, who go into retail type premises and have to go into leases.
Certainly. Firstly, the Retail Leases Act in Victoria has a requirement that if there is a dispute between a tenant and landlord in those premises, that dispute can't go straight off to litigation. It has to come. It has to come to me to try to resolve it. Mandatory referral of that dispute, if you like. And the rationale is to try to keep landlord and tenant out of VCAT in the courts. And VCAT is a relevant jurisdiction for tenancy disputes. Second important point is the Retail Leases Act has a very broad definition of what a retail premise is. So it's not just, if you like, the populist notion of retail. It's not just shoes and furniture and cafes. It covers goods and services. So a doctor's surgery, for example, would be typically retail premises.
Okay, I didn't know.
And the courts have found that the definition is so broad that it covers the provision of goods or services to the user, the consumer of those goods or services. So you can sell to a business, you can sell to the public, and if who you sell to is the predominant consumer, then your premises are retail. So it often turns out that what businesses may not think they're in retail premises in the populist way, but in fact under the Act they're covered by the Retail Tenancies Act.
Okay, would that matter whether they've got some sort of the type of lease? Is there a difference between a retail and say a commercial tenancy lease, or does they sort of blur?
It sort of blurs, unfortunately. The two main standard form leases come from the Law Institute and the Real Estate Institute. And both of them provide a standard form lease which can cover either retail premises or non-retail premises. Now the problem there is that each of them will specify phrases such as, unless the Act applies, these conditions will. And often the tenant isn't familiar enough to know whether the Act applies or not. So that can be a bit confusing. If the Act applies, obviously the Act overrides any of those provisions. Any lease will say what the permitted use of the premises is. That can be quite narrowly defined or very generally defined. And that is a key element in contributing to whether the premises are, in fact, retail tenancy premises.
I guess the more generally defined, the more ambiguity. Does that necessarily lead to more dispute?
Look, it's not a major cause of dispute. Occasionally people will say it's not retail premises, and at the end of the day they can either go off and get a determination judgment from VCAT, or we can try and mediate it, whether it's under the Retail Leases Act or under the Small Business Commissioner Act, and solve the problem. Often where the permitted use is quite narrowly defined, and the tenant starts doing business beyond that use, you can get some problems arising then.
Okay, so what are the most common issues that turn up on your doorstep in terms of the tenant, the landlord?
We get about 1,000 or more of these disputes a year, so we've got pretty good data going back for 11 years. And when I look at the characteristics of retail lease disputes we've received, the profile is pretty consistent. The top 8 or 9 are consistently the top 8 or 9 characteristics. So perhaps not surprisingly, the most common characteristic of a dispute is the tenant owes money, whether it's rent, outgoings, lateness, whatever. 25 to 30% of disputes we get, the tenant owes money. Now there may be other characteristics, but that is a common one. Now that's a tricky one for me to resolve, because basically it says the business is not going as well as the tenant would otherwise like. So the prevention there is really about, before you enter a lease, really do your numbers well.
Yes.
Go in with your eyes open, realise that if you're signing up for a 3-year tenancy, you have to pay the rent for 3 years.
Right.
You can't just change your mind and walk away. So that's the predominant one. The second major one is repairs and maintenance. And this is a question of who is liable, tenant or landlord, for certain types of repairs and maintenance of the property.
Okay.
The Act has some obligations on the landlord, but unfortunately there's a lot of ambiguity in what that means in practice.
Mm-hmm.
So we get a lot of those disputes. For example, heavy rainfall overnight or over the weekend, water's coming through the roof, stock is damaged, dangerous electricity environment, who's liable for repair? And often it will get to not just whether it's the structure, but whether the gutters cleaned, and
Okay.
so there's negotiating space in that.
Yes.
So repairs and maintenance are quite substantial. The third is dispute over amount, an amount payable. So be it rent, be it outgoings, expenses. We get quite a few disputes where the tenant will say, well, the landlord's estimate of outgoings for these category of outgoings was X, and now they've sent me a bill for twice X.
Okay.
Now, the estimate is an estimate. The tenant is still liable to pay those outgoings, even if it's more than it was going to or was estimated to be, unless the amount is just so grossly incorrect that there could be a claim of misrepresentation at the outset.
Yeah.
So they're the main three. Following those, you've got disputes relating to exercising options, which can be problematic. Return of security deposit when the tenant vacates, and often that's tied up with whether or not the tenant has made good the premises on vacation. Return of security deposit, and early termination, people just vacating premises and disappearing. Not a high incidence, but 4 to 5% of matters are the tenants just disappeared.
Okay. A couple of things you touched on there, and that's making good of the premises at the end. And one of the other things that was in my mind, you were talking about the term of the lease. My understanding under the Retail Act, there is a minimum term that a landlord has to give you. Is that correct?
There's a minimum 5-year term
Right.
once a term exceeds 12 months.
Right.
And that 5-year term can comprise a series of options.
Yes.
So you could have a 2+2+2 lease, which is deemed to be more than 5 years because the exercise of the option is at the tenant's discretion, by and large. So there must be a minimum term of 5 years. And the first point you made, I've forgotten.
Oh, I was looking at the making good.
Ah, yes.
Making good at the end.
The obligation of the tenant is to return the premises in the form they were when they entered the premises, subject to fair wear and tear.
Right.
We get a lot of disputes about whether the crack was in the wall when the tenant came in or not, or whether the air conditioning was working when the tenant entered the premises or not. Unlike residential tenancies, there is no statutory requirement for a condition report to be completed at the start of a tenancy, of a retail commercial tenancy. And one easy way to reduce the incidence of disputes is for the tenant and landlord, it works in both parties' favour, to get a very detailed condition report, photos at the start of the tenancy.
Yes.
So in 3, 6, 9 years' time, when memories are faded, there's no dispute about the state of the tenancy at the start.
Right. Okay. What are some of the tips that a person who's thinking of entering into a retail lease should really be considering, before they actually go into the space? I mean, there's probably dozens that you've come across.
Well, the first is, as I said earlier, make sure you understand that entering into a lease is a contract. It's enforceable, and if you've entered a lease term for 3 years, you are liable for all the costs associated with that lease for 3 years, unless the landlord agrees to negotiate out of it.
Yep.
But they don't have to. So if your business, and we get a lot of these, isn't as successful as you thought, and you want to get out in 6 months' time, the landlord doesn't have to agree to that.
Right.
So I guess the prevention measure there is make sure you've done your numbers, you understand exactly what costs you're going to be up for, and that you have enough revenue anticipated to cover the costs.
So and maybe sort of doing a 1 year +2+2 or something like that to make up the 5 years, so you've got opportunity to test your idea. and you've got the security to keep going if it's working for you.
Absolutely. It works in the tenant's favour to get a series of small options.
Yes.
The only downside there is usually when an option's exercised, the rent is recalibrated to market rent.
Yes.
Usually, not always. So that means that you may have had a 2 plus 2 plus 2. At the end of the first 2 years, you exercise the option, but the rent may be recalibrated on a market rent determination.
Right.
So if you had a 5-year term with, say, 3% indexation every year, if the market's strong, that may actually provide a bit of a buffer to rent for those 5 years.
Sure.
Rather than going to market.
Sure. Okay. Other things within the lease, are there certain things that, that oftentimes the tenant particularly doesn't understand or fails to pick up?
On rent, make sure whether it's specified as rent with or without GST.
Yes.
A GST is payable, just clarify that.
Yes.
You need to have a disclosure statement given to you of all the outgoings you have to pay.
Right.
And if you're in shared premises, what proportion of those outgoings you're liable for. And outgoings can be quite a substantial payment, so don't think the rent is the only outlay that you're going to be
Yes.
hit with.
And what are the things that are typically covered by outgoings?
Rates is a very common one.
Yes.
Land tax is void. The landlord can't pass on land tax under a retail tenancy
Right.
lease. Rates is common,
Yeah.
and that would pass through. If there's common property, owners' corporation fees or proportions would be passed on.
Yes.
And of course the tenant would be liable for their own usage of power, electricity,
Yeah,
telephone. Some leases, it's not often, but some leases are gross rent.
Okay.
So you pay X dollars per month as rent,
Yes.
plus GST, but there are no outgoings. So the landlord covers all the outgoings cost. That's relatively unusual.
Right.
So look at how much you're going to be paying for. Check the permitted use.
Right.
I can recall one dispute we had where it was a cafe excluded from providing takeaway fish and chips or chips. And they wanted to expand their business to compete with another in the shopping complex.
Mm-hmm.
And the landlord refused to allow them to sell hot chips because it was excluded from the use. From a tenant's point of view, the broader the use, if it's general retail, for example, it makes it a lot easier for them to sell their business to somebody who comes in and picks up the assignment of the lease. If it's quite narrow, that can limit the opportunity for selling your business in the future.
Okay. Are there any other sort of tips of things that these are the things make sure that you get put into your lease that you can say?
We've talked about term and options.
Yes.
We've talked about rent and outgoings,
Yes.
permitted use. Probably the three major ones, and I'm talking here about your standard form
Yes.
leases. Certainly know who your landlord is and how to serve notices and vice versa. Probably the biggest tip is once you've entered into a lease, pay your rent on time.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental element of any lease that you get access to premises for rent paid.
Yes.
And if you fail to pay rent on time, you can easily, if you don't rectify that within 14 days of a notice, you can be locked out.
Right.
And all your business that you build up may be removed from your control.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes we find people will withhold rent because the landlord's not responding on a repairs and maintenance issue.
Yes.
In my view, that's a very risky step. You're far better to bring the repairs and maintenance dispute to us, get that resolved, and don't run the risk of being locked out.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I can't remember now, but you'll be much more across the leases than me, whether that withholding rent actually is not legally appropriate within most leases, I believe.
That's correct. There are a couple of provisions, for example, the Building Act, which defines the owner's obligations for essential safety measures.
Yes.
The Building Act actually specifies that you can withhold rent if you incur costs for certain safety measures. That's a legal out.
Mm-hmm.
I still think it's pretty risky to do that.
Yes.
And I'd be more inclined to pay the rent and focus the dispute on the matter in dispute.
Yeah. I guess one of it's probably a common sense thing. The closer you work with the landlord, the better the relationship that you have, assuming the landlord's willing to do that. then obviously the least opportunity there is for things to get out of hand.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a lease is an unusual business contract because you're in it together for a period of time. You can't change your mind and walk away, well, without substantial cost. And the more you can engage in a good working relationship with the landlord, the better. Of course, most landlords use agents, and sometimes tenants find it difficult to be sure they're actually engaging with the landlord behind the agent. A good agent should enable that to happen and pass through requests and comments. But that can sometimes be a cause of a dispute too.
Okay. I was just going to ask that, whether that's a dispute, because sometimes, you know, the agents don't necessarily, I guess it's like everything in life, you've got good and bad in every area, and sometimes the agents are not necessarily as professional as you would like them to be, or as responsive as you'd like them to be. Do you find you have disputes with under the retail tenancy side of things, with the tenant and the agent, as distinct from with the landlord?
Often a tenant will present it that way,
yes,
but the agent is an agent of the landlord.
Yes.
And so the dispute technically is between the tenant and landlord,
Yes.
Even though in occasional cases it's the agent which is exacerbating the problem,
yes,
if you like. We will often find the agent will come along with the landlord to mediation.
Yes.
And that's good, because sometimes in private session they can arrange their own negotiated settlement to a dispute which may have been exacerbated by, for example, the agent's conduct.
Sure.
But look, by and large, the agents do a pretty good job, I think.
Yeah. Great. Geoff Browne, thank you very much for spending some time with us yet again, talking about retail leases and some of the tips and pitfalls of getting involved in retail.
Thanks.
Thank you.